Hello and welcome to Unravelling. We're now in part 3 where we are looking at the topic of gender. So if you haven't yet seen parts 1 and 2 of Unravelling, please pause here and go back and watch those videos. That is going to be really important as we move on. Because once we have finished the topic of gender, we'll be moving on to part 4 of Unravelling where we are looking at sex, sexuality and marriage. So, welcome Tim.
Good evening.
It's good to have you back.
Nice to be here.
So, we are looking at gender. How are we going to be tackling the topic of gender?
So in part 3, we're going to be doing 3 videos. The first one that we're filming tonight is really going to be looking at the conversation going on in our culture. And then the next one, part 2, we'll be exploring a Christian worldview on the issue of gender. And so naturally then the third video will be more asking the question, well, how then do we live? If this is what a Christian worldview's got to say, and this is what's going on in our culture, how do we then live? How do we respond? How do we react to issues of gender? So that's the layout.
That's the flow.
Yeah. And we wanted to say at the start, actually, that when we're talking about issues of gender, obviously we are talking about real people. Some of the stuff we'll cover tonight around gender dysphoria and transgender identities are really personal and concern humans, the choices they make, the things that they experience. And, we're giving that due weight because that's really important. Hopefully, as you see as we go on, we'll be sort of trying to tease some of that out. But we're not just talking about individuals, we're also talking about a cultural movement that's got a whole worldview and worldview issues attached to it, that's got political implications, that's fueling some of the culture war that's going on. So we're just aware there's a danger that when we're talking about some of this transgender in the public square, there may be people who watch this and say, yeah, but what about the people that are affected by this?
Yeah, real people.
Yeah. And when we're talking about the real people that are affected, some might think, but hold on a minute, there's a whole load of issues in the public square. And we just wanted to say that we know, and we're going to do our best to give due weight to everything, but we can't do it all at the same moment. So if something feels unbalanced in the moment, stick with us through all 3 videos, and hopefully as a package, they'll seek to address everything that matters as much as we can. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that at the start of these videos, I'm always banging on about if you haven't caught up, if you're not up to date, if you haven't watched parts 1 and 2. Yeah. So why is it important that people have seen parts 1, parts 2, and sort of go through it in that way?
I mean, it's important to understand it, is the basic answer. Where we're at in our culture on gender didn't come out of nowhere. It's come out of the way our culture's developed over a period of time, which is what we explored in part 1. And if we're going to look at a Christian worldview towards gender, you need to know about how we form a Christian worldview, which was part 2. So you're not really going to understand part 3 without having watched the others. And we're going to assume knowledge, so we'll be referencing back all the time to. Do you remember that? Do you remember
Banging on about what we've talked about before.
And if you didn't watch it, you're not going to remember it, are you? So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so gender.
Yeah.
It's a massive topic.
Yeah.
And quite a controversial one, isn't it?
It is at the moment, isn't it? Yeah, we've got a few examples of where the controversy has bubbled to the surface recently. So I'm not sure if you saw the leaders' debates in the 2024 general election that we had. But the final one between Starmer and Sunak, they were asked about their views on issues around gender identity and equality legislation and trying to drill down into even their own understanding of what it is to be a certain gender. And I don't remember this on any previous leaders' debates. I'm pretty sure it didn't feature last time or the time before that. But it did on this one.
So in a sense, it's like it's been a growing issue or a growing topic of conversation.
It's a big enough one that it's made the leaders' debate. Yeah. And this is despite the fact that, according to the last census we did in 2021 in the UK, only 262,000 people in the whole country identify as transgender. So that's like 0.5% of the population. There's not many issues that have 0.5% of the population engaged in that make the leaders' debate. Yeah. But obviously this issue has gone way beyond that 0.5%, and a far more significant number of people in the country are talking about it. And that's partly due to the influence of celebrities.
Yes. So
recognise these guys?
I do. So we've got Elon and J.K. Rowling.
Both of them well known for their controversial views on gender that they've made very public. J.K. Rowling, to the extent where she's got to have sort of 24/7 security detail.
Yeah, it's been cancelled from lots of things, and
yeah, she's a sort of a big name in the debates. And Elon Musk recently said he's moving his operations out of California because of some recent legislation they've introduced around transgender, and he's obviously in charge of
it's a massive decision to make, isn't it? Yeah.
And they're also both being sued at the moment by the boxer from the 2024 Olympics. I don't know if you caught the controversy.
I saw about the controversy, but I didn't know that a lawsuit was happening.
So one of the female boxers who actually won a medal, she is now suing these guys for their views on her and her eligibility to take part. So they're just one of many sort of sets of celebrities that are making a big noise about this in the public square. And another thing that's made big noise in the public square over the last couple of years has been around the Tavistock Centre. So it's not a very impressive building, but this is where gender identity services for children and young people have mainly been happening in the UK. Set up in 1989, but recently closed. And we're going to explore a little bit about that as we go through tonight. But yeah, it's a name that many people might be familiar with, even if they don't really know about it, because it's been a lot of debate around it.
A lot.
Yeah, huge amount. Yeah. So that's what we're going to get stuck into. These and new approaches to gender in the first half, and then we'll look at the critical pushback to those from within our culture. And we say approaches because there are more than one approach. And the stuff we're going to talk about tonight is not one institution, one movement, one organisation and what they say. It's a range of different factors that have all come to the fore. So we're trying to describe a fairly complex cultural phenomenon, and that's why we're using the word approaches. You know, there's a multiple...
So there's a few approaches that we're going to look at.
Yeah, and they overlap to some extent, but we just don't want to give anyone the impression that there's like one movement and we're going to describe it. There's not. And same for when we look at the pushback, we'll see that pushback comes from many different quarters in different ways. Hopefully it'll make sense as we go along. Yeah.
So can you tell us about these new approaches then?
Yeah, let's get stuck in. So the first angle that we're going to look at this from is philosophical and ideological angles. So what are the new approaches to gender in the realm of ideas, essentially? And the first big one is that all these new approaches, the sort of fundamental claim that they make is that gender is detached from biological sex.
Yep.
So there's long been a helpful distinction between gender and biological sex. So by sex, we really refer to who we are in our physical, biological bodies, and that is to do with our chromosomes, our anatomy, our reproductive systems, our primary and secondary sex characteristics, our hormones. This is what it is to be biologically a man or a woman. But by gender, what we've tended to refer to is the experience and expression of being a man or a woman in a particular time and place. So, for example, we might say, who wears tights? Is it men or is it women?
Well, I'd say women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the whole, in our culture, the gender stereotype, if you like, is that women would wear tights. But then, if we went back to King Henry VIII in the medieval era, there he is, wearing his tights.
Looking very strapping in his tights. There.
Absolutely, as did many of the, as did many men back then. It was more normal then for men to wear tights, particularly if you're in the upper echelons of society. And we could pick on loads of examples like this. Could be like what hats you wear, whether your hair should be long or short. Is it a woman thing to have your hair long, or is it a man thing? Well, that depends when and where we're talking about.
Where you are, when you are.
Exactly. So gender is the social construction of our maleness or femaleness, and sex is who we are biologically. That's been the distinction that has long been drawn, but it's also tended to be assumed and argued for that our gender and our biological sex are connected. So who you are expressing your maleness or femaleness in a particular culture is nonetheless tied to your biological sex, even though we can distinguish between them. Yeah. But the claim that's being made by the new approaches to gender is to totally separate the idea of biological sex from your gender. And to illustrate this, we're going to look at some of the writing of Dr. Deanna Adkins. I've chosen her because she's a well-known paediatrician in America. She was involved in setting up a treatment centre for young people with gender dysphoria, children and young people with gender dysphoria. I think it's at Duke. To check my notes, yes, at the Duke. So she founded the Duke Centre for Child and Adolescent Gender Care in 2015. And she was an expert witness in a legal case in America and laid out her understanding of gender and sex, which is really helpful for us to see that written down. So here's some of the things that she said. So at birth, infants are generally classified as male or female based on observation of their external genitalia. This classification becomes the person's birth assigned sex, but may not be the same as the person's gender identity. A person's gender identity refers to a person's inner sense of belonging to a particular gender, such as male or female. And she goes on to say that from a medical perspective, the appropriate determinant of sex is gender identity. So we might need to read that through once or twice to take it in, but what she's doing is it's turning the picture around from the one that existed before these new approaches to gender. Yeah. So rather than sex being something that's given and innate, and your gender being socially constructed, she's now saying, actually, it's your gender identity that is innate, your feelings and expression of being a particular gender, and your sex, with regards to your body, it's that that's socially constructed. That's what's assigned.
It feels like almost like a pulling apart of the two.
Yeah.
They're separate now.
Yeah, they are.
They are no longer the same, one and the same. They are now two separate things.
That's what she says, yeah, that's right, but may not be the same as a person's gender identity. And Deanna Adkins knows that for most people they are the same.
Yep.
But you're right, she says they're actually not connected, essentially, and your gender identity can be different. So as these statements make clear, really, that these new approaches to gender is now detached from biological sex. And as Deanna Adkins' stuff also said, point 2, gender is now self-defined based on your inner feelings. That was literally what she said. Your inner sense of being a man and a woman is the appropriate definition, medical appropriate definition of gender. And this has two consequences. First of all, if our gender is just defined by our inner world rather than by our body, then there's no longer just two genders. There can be any number of genders. There can be gender fluidity based on how we feel. And this is what we see. So I'm not on Facebook anymore. I don't know if you're on Facebook
I
still,
am, but I mean, I haven't seen this.
Well, you should maybe go back and check your Facebook, because I have it on reasonable authority that when you now go to select your gender on Facebook, you have dozens and dozens of options, of which only a few are here on the slide. So gender fluid, gender variant, gender queer, gender questioning, and so on. And so new symbols, someone had a go at developing some new symbols for all of these. I think it's not meant to be taken entirely seriously, the kind of pictures of symbols behind.
Wow.
But this is a true consequence of this belief that gender is defined by our inner world, that then the kind of expression of our gender then can become multiple and various and changeable in these ways. So that's the first consequence. And the second consequence is that if gender is defined by our feelings rather than our bodies, then talking about general differences between men and women is very difficult to do, because our bodies don't define our gender. And so generalised men are like this, women are like this, you can't really claim that anymore. Or if you can, you also have to give that with the qualifier, these differences don't really matter.
Right.
Because our bodies
we can no longer assume men are stronger than women.
Exactly.
Because that's based on a physical difference.
Exactly. Which isn't actually how we identify our gender. So these new approaches to gender are heavily promoted by our entertainment culture. It's been at the forefront of delivering to the popular consciousness these new approaches to gender. So we've got a few examples here. So I don't know if you recognise this person.
Yep, I know Sam Smith.
So I didn't recognise this picture until I did a bit of research, but Sam Smith was one of the first artists, to my knowledge, to go public with wanting to identify as non-binary. So rather than being a he, as he was formerly, Sam Smith is now a they.
Okay.
And that's their preferred pronoun. And so they were perhaps one of the first in 2019, but this has picked up steam, and a lot of artists are now advocating these new approaches to gender. So I don't know if you saw Eurovision this year, the 2024 Eurovision.
Oh,
Are you a
no.
Eurovision watcher?
I'm not a Eurovision watcher. No, I'm not.
Well,
So I missed it.
I have seen it a couple of times, but I didn't see it this year. But this year was celebrated by those who advocate for the new approaches to gender, because it had more LGBT acts than had ever appeared before at Eurovision, including 2 acts that, like Sam Smith, were non-binary
Right.
in their gender identity, including the winner.
Okay.
So this is Nemo with the song The Code, and they won Eurovision 2024. Right. And the song itself that they won with speaks about their journey of discovering their now non-binary gender identity. So the song talks about finding a third way, okay, breaking the code,
right,
and being able to become something different. So yeah, that's Nemo. And hopefully what you can see in these new ideas, philosophical, ideological approaches to gender, is the identity story.
Yeah, what we talked about right back in the first video.
First video we ever did
part
together.
One. Yeah, the identity story.
Yeah, you can be whoever you want to be, determined by your inner world, your thoughts and feelings, then expressed outwardly, and that has to then be recognised.
Reflected back by others, and
that is this going on. So there's another flag if people need it to watch part 1.
Yes, go back and watch it if you haven't watched it.
Okay, so there's some of the ideas that are behind the new approaches to gender, but then those ideas then go and inform medicine and science and that community. And the first example is one that we've already talked about a bit, actually, that sex is now assigned at birth rather than recognised. That's becoming common parlance. So rather than having your baby and lifting them up and having a look and seeing, you know, oh, it's a boy or a girl, and recognising that, we're still doing that, but now we're assigning that gender to that child, which may or may not be correct as the child grows up. And so new languages develop, like we talked about back in a previous video, where if that person's gender identity ends up being the same as the sex they were assigned at birth, they're known as cisgender.
Yes,
and if it's different, they're known as transgender. And this new language has actually been the focus of a bit of disgruntlement and culture wars internal to the Guardian newspaper, as one illustration. So over the last few years, there's been a fight going on within the Guardian newspaper over this sort of language. So initially there were some editorial guidelines given out that journalists should use cis male, cis female to describe the gender of non-transgender people. And adopt that language kind of in the paper. And then a couple of months later, there was some new guidance issued rowing back from that. And as I understand it, what was going on behind the scenes is you had one pressure group saying we need to adopt this language, this is a social justice issue. And then you had another group of feminists saying, actually, this isn't correct and we need to not adopt this language. And we'll go on to explore the feminist pushback later. But The Guardian is one of our left-leaning newspapers, and they are in the midst of this fight of kind of whether language should be adopted. So that's an example, again, another example of the liveness of this issue. So that's the first thing that's going on medically. The second thing, the thing that's going to take us a bit longer to talk about, is that gender dysphoria has been reframed. And when I say gender dysphoria, I realise that probably a lot of people won't necessarily have heard of that condition before. We probably have heard of talk of transgender, not necessarily of gender dysphoria. So I want to take a little bit of time to explain what this is,
really helpful,
if that's okay.
Yeah, brilliant.
And what's going on, because this is being sucked up into the culture wars around transgender. But it's actually been a long-standing medical condition, and so to try and get a helpful grasp on it that is respectful of what it actually is, I think we need to take a bit of time, if that's okay. So let's start with some definitions, just so we know where we are. So transgender, the American Psychiatric Association defines this as a person whose sex assigned at birth, there's that language.
Yeah, we know about that assigned language.
Yeah, usually based on external genitalia, does not align with their gender identity, their psychological sense of their gender. We should get that after this video.
So that's the definition of transgender.
Yeah.
Okay.
So 0.5% of people in this country identify like that according to the census. Gender dysphoria, though, is a psychological condition, and the definition of that, according to what's known as the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So this is a common diagnostic handbook that's used particularly by American but also by British psychiatrists. So according to this, gender dysphoria is where there's psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. So it's distressing psychologically that you may have the sex, the biological sex of a woman, but feel your gender identity is male, and this is highly distressing for you. This is what we mean by gender dysphoria. And it's important to separate them because occasionally you come across the two being used as if they're the same thing.
Yes.
But they're not. So, like we saw earlier, transgender prevalence, how many people are we talking about? 0.5% of the population.
Okay.
But for gender dysphoria, the DSM that we just talked about actually says that this is with 0.005 to 0.014% of men, of adult males, and about half that of adult females. So I don't know, sort of your decimals and the maths can be confusing sometimes, but we're talking maybe about 1 in 50
so a lot less
transgender
people have got gender dysphoria.
Yeah, a lot less.
Right.
So
Okay.
maybe between 1 in 50 and 1 in 100 transgender people actually suffer from gender dysphoria.
Right.
So it's
So the two don't necessarily go together.
and often don't.
Yeah.
And often don't. So if you are transgender,
you don't necessarily suffer
probably
from
not.
gender dysphoria.
Exactly,
No,
and that's
helpful.
quite important to recognise. So when we talk about gender dysphoria and the issues that affect that, most transgender people are not affected by that.
Okay.
So let's be clear about that. What's it like to suffer with gender dysphoria? And then we're talking about people who have a distressing psychological condition. And I've got a couple of extracts from a book by Preston Sprinkle. He's a Christian. He's written on gender-related issues, and he provides us with a few descriptions of this from people that he's interviewed. So I'm just going to read them out. So what's it like to have gender dysphoria? Well, it's the piercing to the heart feeling when you feel like every single person in the room is staring at you, like your heart is ripped open and they're just picking at the pieces. This may sound pretty harsh to someone who has never experienced gender dysphoria. However, for me, it happens in some degree almost every time I'm out in public places with people around me. Yeah.
It's really sad.
Yeah. Yeah, sobering really. Got another one here. What's it like to experience gender dysphoria? Well, it's like an electric current through my body that caused my joints to ache, my stomach to turn, my hands to shake, and nausea in the most severe moments of dysphoria. So describing some of the sort of physical manifestation of that, not just psychological. And so this is a really troubling thing to experience. As I understand it, people don't choose to have gender dysphoria. This is something that you sort of happens to you in that sense. But it is important that we recognise how this is being reframed in the new approaches to gender. So it used to be that this experience was called gender identity disorder. That was its old name, previous to 2013. And that was because the understanding was that if you experience that psychological disconnection from your bodily sex, your gender identity was incongruent,
Yeah.
that was a psychological disorder. That was something in your mind that was going wrong.
Yeah.
But now, since 2013, it's been described as gender dysphoria, and the definition is now on the distress. So this is only a psychological condition that needs to be treated if there's significant distress.
Okay.
So having incongruence between your gender identity and your body.
So that's no longer considered necessarily a psychological issue.
Exactly.
But if it causes distress.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So can you see how it's been reframed?
Yeah.
It's having gender identity that's different is just a difference. It's not a disorder.
Yeah. And
it's
may
not
not be
something
distressing.
gone wrong. May not. Well, for most people, isn't in this way.
Yeah.
But if you suffer gender dysphoria like this, it's the distress that makes it a psychological condition that needs treating.
Okay.
So we're not here to adjudicate this change, but just to notice that it's happened and that this change does fit with the trajectory of the new approaches to gender that we're exploring tonight. So it's not a surprising change in that sense.
Yeah.
It's one that fits very much with where we are. And the other thing to notice before we move on is that there's a high correlation of other mental health conditions with gender dysphoria. So depression, anxiety, suicidality, these are all much greater amongst those with gender dysphoria. So this correlation is present. Whether it's also causation is debated and we'll get into as we go along. But whenever we're talking about people suffering with gender dysphoria, we shouldn't be surprised if they're also suffering with other mental health conditions as well. Yeah, far more likely to have really difficult outcomes in those other health conditions as well. Which takes us actually onto the question of treatment. So if this is what it is, how should we treat gender dysphoria? And again, we've seen a difference really in approach to treating gender dysphoria in this era of new approaches to gender. So the basic treatment question, when there's an incongruence between your feelings and your inner world and your body, there's two basic options. You can either seek to change your inner world, change your psychology to more greatly align with your body,
Your biology,
or you change your body to align with your psychology. So whether you change the internals or the externals is the key treatment decision. And if we go back to Dr. Deanna Adkins, she explains really why we're now in an era where the emphasis is on changing the externals. So she says, a person's gender identity, regardless of whether that identity matches other sex-related characteristics, is fixed, cannot be changed by others, and is not undermined or altered by the existence of other sex-related characteristics that do not align with it. And perhaps the key word there is it's fixed.
Right.
So expert paediatrician in this area says that your gender identity, your inner sense of being whatever you feel you are, that's the thing that's fixed. So if your inner gender identity is the thing that's fixed, then it logically makes sense that the only treatment available really is to do with changing the externals.
Yeah, you need to change your body.
You need to change your body. Or before that, often, normally the first stage of treatment is social transitioning.
Right.
So you may not change anything about your body, but you would change perhaps the way you dress, the way you manage your appearance.
With family or friends.
That's right. Change your pronouns, change your name, start living as the other gender or what the gender that you choose. And say if you were male to female, you might then want to be in traditionally women's spaces rather than men's, and you would want people to think of you as a woman. So this is social transitioning.
Okay.
And that is enough for some people, according to those who treat them, that can be one treatment path. If that's not sufficient, then things move on to hormone treatment. Right. And then beyond that onto surgery is the normal treatment path. So if it was you seeking to transition, you would be injected with male hormones. I'd be injected with female hormones. Those will start to affect our secondary sex characteristics. Changes. Your voice would drop. You would start to maybe grow facial hair, and these sort of things would happen to us with the hormones. And then you can go and have surgery. So typically you might start with a double mastectomy, or if it was me, I might start with breast implants and all sorts of surgeries available, and it tends to be that different people stop at different stages along that process. It's not that everyone goes all the way.
You don't have to go, yeah.
Well, because the idea of the treatment is to relieve your distress.
Yeah.
So when you get to a point that you feel your distress is relieved, there's no need to go further, if that makes sense. And we can see that this has become mainstream as the appropriate treatment option. So WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, that's what it says on the tin, in their Standards of Care 2011, hormones and surgery are the medically necessary intervention for many people identifying as transgender. So that's really clear, isn't it, of where that trajectory is going.
Some form of medical intervention, you know, along that is going to be necessary for most people. Yeah,
and that's the appropriate choice. And even our very own NHS online, I thought this was interesting, that in their description of gender dysphoria, they say gender dysphoria is not a mental illness, as it perhaps used to be seen, but some people may develop mental health problems because of gender dysphoria. So that's a highly controversial claim, but again reveals the emphasis really that it's not the mind that needs to change, therefore it's the body that needs to change. And so it's increasingly unacceptable to treat gender dysphoria as if it's a mental illness. And then the new norm of treatment is sometimes called affirmative care. So when a person comes and says, this is how I feel, you affirm them in their gender identity and then take whatever steps they would like in terms of hormones or surgery to relieve their distress. And that affirmative care has been anyway for a while a bit of a new normal in these new approaches to gender. Does that make sense?
Yeah, really clear, thank you.
So this has become the sort of normalised treatment pathway now in these new approaches to gender for adults. But it's also largely the same approach when it comes to treating children, which we want to talk a bit about now. So we're going to come back to the Tavistock Centre that we flagged up at the start. So this was established in 1989 as the specialist services in the UK for dealing with children and young people, so under 17s, who struggled with their gender identity. And in its initial years, it focused on providing talking therapies largely and accompanying young people through those struggles. And I guess to use our schematic, it was focused more on supporting them in perhaps resolving their inner world.
So the psychology and their feelings.
Their incongruence that way. So in 2009, it was established as kind of the statutory place for treating across the whole country on these issues. And in the years since then, things changed dramatically. So for a start, the number of children that they saw massively increased.
Right.
Previous to 2009, then 2/3 of the people that they saw were natal males who were struggling with their gender identity. Natal. So sex assigned at birth was male. But from 2009 onwards, that started to flip until more like 2/3 of those they saw had been assigned female at birth. And treatment drastically changed. So talking therapies were sidelined and became rarely offered. And the normal course of treatment was social transitioning for a child with this incongruence in their gender identity, and puberty blockers.
Yes, that's been really, I've heard a lot about that in the media, the use of puberty blockers. That seems to be like a real headline grabber.
It is, and we'll come back to it a little bit later. But essentially what they do is they stop you entering puberty as you normally would. And the idea is that if you may be transgender, your gender identity may not be in line with your body, it stops the sexual development that normally happens at puberty, so would save you distress down the road, is the idea. And so that became the normal treatment offered at the Tavistock Centre. It's in line with affirmative care, as we talked about. And often this was supported by the appeals to the mental health issues that are often associated and come with gender dysphoria. So often the argument has been that if you don't offer this kind of treatment, then these children will run a higher risk of suicide or other poor mental health outcomes, and therefore this is the best kind of treatment that we can offer them. So that's how that's played out in the treatment of children medically. Finally, in terms of new approaches to gender that are medical, scientific, we have to talk about disorders of sexual development. So we've done
so we've got a lot of acronyms.
Yeah, we've done a fair bit of explaining tonight, but bear with us because this is really important. Again, because it is about people actually, and it's often enfolded in the debate. But again, for people who have disorders of sexual development, DSDs, we need to know what we're talking about to do that.
So what is that then?
So disorders of sexual development are where we don't develop in the normal ways that our sexual development takes. So this might be to do with our chromosomes. So normally it's XX or XY for male or female, but it's possible, for example, to have XXY chromosome. That's something called Klinefelter syndrome. And so that's one kind of DSD where your hormones aren't as they normally are. Or another one might be to do with your gonads, that you have both male and female sex organs, or it might be to do with your hormone levels.
Right.
So there's lots of different kinds. We're not going to walk through each one, but enough to say that they exist, and they're sometimes captured by the term intersex as well. So if you hear intersex, that's another way of talking about these DSDs. And in terms of prevalence, how many people have these? It's about 1 in 5,000 will have some kind of DSD. You do sometimes come across other numbers, say 1.7% is a number that I've come across out there. Okay. But those higher numbers are normally working with a very, very, very broad definition of a DSD that I think is fairly misleading.
So why is it important that we understand about DSDs?
It's important because these are being used by some of those in the new approaches to gender as a reason for why we should deconstruct our gender binary. So if we go to Gianna Atkins again, who's helped us out a lot with articulating this kind of thing, she lists a number of DSDs in her writing, and then says, as the above examples underscore, biological sex is not an accurate or useful medical term with respect to individuals whose sex-related characteristics are not in alignment with each other. Rather, the medically appropriate determinant of sex is gender identity. So, because DSDs exist, biological sex is not appropriate, it's not adequate for capturing because of these exceptions. Therefore, gender identity has to be what determines sex. So that's why it matters, because it's used in the debate to deconstruct a gender binary and reaffirm gender identity as the sort of core way that we determine sex, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, yeah.
Maybe just pause and reflect before we move on. We can see, hopefully, how the ideas and the philosophy of the new approaches to gender is informing what's going on medically. And hopefully can see that these issues, although they overlap, we need to be careful not to blend them all together. So political activists in new approaches to gender shouldn't be confused with individuals experiencing gender dysphoria and medical professionals who are trying to work out what's the best way to care for people who have this condition. And I know they're all wrapped up together, that's why we're doing them in one video, but we need to try not to do that in our own minds, to assume it's all the same thing, because they're different strands of this that's going on. So with that being said, perhaps we could move on to talk about the public square, the sort of political, cultural public square.
So this is another new approach.
Yeah, more new approaches, how these new approaches are working out in this dimension. So the first one I'll mention, but we don't need to go into because we've discussed it a fair bit already, that gender is now presented as a personal choice and not a bodily given. And so we've talked about that medically. In terms of what's going on culturally, we've met this before as well. Do you remember?
Yes, we've seen the gender unicorn. We've mentioned that was that in the identity story?
I think this was the power and oppression story. So, but it was, oh no, it might have been. I don't know now. We need to go back and watch the videos.
If somebody can comment and tell us, that'd be great. Stick it in the comments section.
But what we saw is that this is being taught in schools. It's a common resource. It's just one expression, educational culture of that point. So I don't really want to dwell on that too much. What these new approaches also do in the political sphere then is to claim that the gender binary, we're male or female, this is oppressive.
Right.
And it causes suffering. So if you are transgender or gender fluid in some way, if you don't buy into the gender binary, if that's not how you understand yourself, then to present that as normal is often to present that as the thing that's good, and therefore it's shameful or lesser or marginalised.
Excludes
it's
others.
Exclusive, in itself.
Okay.
And that's the important thing, that it's not that you have to be trying to do that to someone, but by maintaining a gender binary as normative, it inherently is doing that to those who don't sit comfortably within it. And so what we then see is a load of lobbying in the public square for government policy, but not just government policy, actually, any institutional policy, any public environment, to be as accepting as possible of people's self-chosen gender identity, and for practical decisions to orientate around that. And so, again, this is the stuff that often hits the headlines, isn't it?
Yes, it's often what we, you often see stories, don't we, about how, like you say, that lobbying takes place, or changes that are made to organisations based on, decisions because of people have been lobbied to do that. And so, we do see a lot of that. Yeah,
well, I think we'll talk about some more examples in the second half, but it's often in this context where you get phrases like trans women are real women. Yeah. And these kind of
you get the slogans,
catchphrases and slogans is to do with this lobbying and public policy. That's why it ended up in the leaders' debate in the general election, etc. That sort of thing. And then along with that, disagreement to the new approaches to gender can often then be framed as immoral.
Yes.
Ignorant, bigoted, how dare you tell someone else what they need to be, or
and that's what we saw when you showed us J.K. Rowling. That's what's happened with her. That's definitely how she's been labelled as bigoted, and so
Kathleen Stock, we talked about her, the Oxford debate where there's loads of protests. So you could be immoral, you could just be ignorant. That's Deanna Atkins, this is now the way we do medicine. You're holding archaic, out-of-date views.
And I guess that's where we then get the push on the education side, like say with the gender unicorn, because it's almost, we need to educate people to the new way we're doing this.
That's part of the progressive, that label is the idea of moving forward, isn't it, into new knowledge. Or just simply bigoted. So if you disagree, sometimes you're just transphobic. And that's what it comes down to. And obviously going through this, we're now starting to talk about the activist side of this, aren't we?
Yes.
This is those who are campaigning for these new approaches in these ways. And that's our final point, really, that a lot of the activism around this is very pragmatic. There's not a huge amount of energy expended in writing big philosophical books justifying the new ideology, making sure that everything is lined up and there's a cohesive movement. It's about getting things done.
Right.
That Karl Marx quote comes to mind of the aim is to change the world. And that's very much the approach of a lot of the activists. So they're often willing to pull on whatever strand would be helpful to advance the cause.
Do you think that's why we've seen so much change in relatively a short amount of time?
Well, I think the reason we've seen so much change is definitely partly that, and partly all the stuff we explored in part one of when we get where our culture's at, this is inevitable, if you like. But that's why you can also find, if you're trying to engage in this, that sometimes the issue can jump around. So you might think you're talking about public policy, but then end up talking about gender dysphoria. That's why we've gone into that. And then you're talking about something else. And again, that's not to pass a judgment on whether that's right or wrong. If you want to get this done, you want to get this done. But it is a feature of the new approaches to gender that it's highly pragmatic in the way that it plays out, really. So I think that brings our discussion of the new approaches of gender to a close. There's always more to be said, but I think we've said enough, and what we need to do now really is move on and look at the pushback.
Yes. So You say that there's been quite a bit of pushback,
Yeah.
and we've talked about it being quite controversial. So
Yeah.
where does some of this sort of controversy come from, or where does the pushback, where is that coming from?
Well, the answer really is from lots of different places, and we're going to pick apart 4 or 5 tonight and show again it's not one approach being responded to by one criticism. There's a whole wave of them. But I want to start with feminists, because perhaps some of the most potent criticism in recent years, pushback and the new approach to gender, has come from feminists. And the sort of starting point, the first objection, is to say that the transgender movement actually damages women's health.
Right.
And a good representative of this kind of argument is Abigail Shrier, who wrote this book, published in 2020, I believe, Irreversible Damage, Teenage Girls and the Transgender Craze. And her starting point in this book is to look at some of the recent statistics for treatment of gender dysphoria. So if you remember, we saw earlier that the prevalence of gender dysphoria is actually very low and is mainly males. But she noticed that it used to be fewer than 1 in 10,000 people, mostly males, who sought treatment for gender dysphoria. But in the last decade, she notices that now it's primarily females, sex assigned at birth being female, who have sought treatment. And the stats have shot up, so an over 4,000% increase of children, teenagers seeking treatment for gender dysphoria in this country. And so that's her starting point. And she asked the question, what is going on?
Yeah.
If those sort of stats were happening for any other medical condition, we would be asking.
We'd be looking deeply into why is that happening.
That's right. And so another of the stats that she noticed in 2016, she says 46% of sex reassignment surgery was for females to male, female to male surgery. But just a year later, that had jumped to 70%. And then that higher figure had sort of stuck for a while. So asking the same sort of question, really. And much of this growth is in young people who did not experience gender dysphoria as a child.
Okay.
And this phenomenon led this lady, Dr. Lippman, who researched and worked in this area, to talk about late onset gender dysphoria as a particular designation for this phenomenon of young people, often teenage girls, with no history of gender dysphoria, presenting with gender dysphoria later on in their childhood and in their adolescence. And Abigail Shrier makes the argument that this is being driven by our new approaches to gender that are transmitted through cultural mediums like YouTube, etc.
Yes.
She'll point to evidence like it's often clusters of friends that will all turn to this at the same time.
So she's sort of saying it's more of a social, it's working out in society and therefore affecting a higher number of girls because of that.
She's essentially saying this kind of gender dysphoria is not like the kind that we were talking about earlier, but is a manifestation of the transgender movement in our culture. But what she says is this has massive impact on these girls. They have operations, they have hormone treatment. This has significant physical consequences that she argues are damaging for them. And so she raises the red flag and says, what's going on here? This can't be the best way to help these distressed young girls, is to push them down that path, given the kind of evidence that she presents, really. And she's not alone. Many feminists are making these kind of arguments. Here's another book, Transgender Children and Young People, written by Heather Brunskill-Evans and Michelle Moore. Well, they edit it. It's a collection of essays. They're both academics based in the UK. And one of the things that they noticed is that a lot of the young people who were presenting, a lot of these teenage girls presenting as having gender dysphoria, particularly at the Tavistock Clinic, that many of them might have homosexual feelings, be same-sex attracted, or they may have quite rigid gender role stereotypes. And so some of the presenting as trans, they're saying might actually be issues around their sexuality or around their understanding of gender in our culture that could be tackled a very different way. So they raise, again, concerns that are we really serving these girls well by pushing them down what has become the standard treatment route when there may be other things going on. And in a way, this reveals that although we use the acronym LGBTQI+, etc., although that acronym is common parlance, what it masks is that that movement can be deeply divided at points, including at this point. So the LGB, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, can be in real tension with the transgender movement, because it might well be the case that for several people seeking this kind of help, what's really going on is they may be homosexual, and there's a level of shame or attached to that, or that's not accepted, or they believe that because they have those feelings, they must therefore be the other gender.
Right.
And so you can see how the perspectives of both of those movements don't cohere, but actually conflict.
Okay.
And this is where we get the acronym TERF from as well. Have you come across this?
Yes, we talked about that at a point, but remind me what it is.
So TERF stands for Trans Excluding Radical Feminists.
Yes.
So feminists like Heather and Michelle or Abigail Schreier, who say the transgender movement is actually harmful to women, they become trans-excluding radical feminists. And it is, you know, it's a mudslinging exercise, so it's a name that you call people.
Yeah.
But this is why, because there's tension within the movement, really.
Okay.
And this is because if we move on a little bit, another of the things that they criticise is that the trans movement, it removes female-only environments. And this is the stuff that often hits the headlines, isn't it? So
I've seen things about prisons.
Exactly.
You know, where do you put certain people in the prison system?
There's a big case in Scotland, wasn't there, about a male to female trans person who was placed in a women's prison and then removed from a women's prison.
Yeah.
Changing rooms, toilets, brownies, environments like that, kind of these traditionally women-only environments. Feminists have big concerns that they're being removed, and now we get that's where TERF makes sense, because they want to exclude trans women from those environments.
Yes.
But if trans women are real women, that's problematic.
Okay.
Perhaps overall, and finally in terms of the feminist pushback, at a basic level they claim that if we deconstruct the concept of woman, so if being a woman is not to do with your body, then they say, well, this is a problem. For years and years, for decades and decades, feminists have worked to say there's real value to being a woman.
Yes.
That women bring a particular perspective, they have equal value, they should have political rights, they should have cultural rights, educational rights, and there's something unique and valuable about being a woman that's different from being a man, that adds value, and that's feminism 101, if you like, that's first wave feminism. But if we now deconstruct the concept of woman, if that's nothing to do with your body anymore, then we also undermine the sense of what is particularly it is that a woman can bring. Okay. Because it's not to do with your body, it's your gender identity as you define it for yourself, really. And this reveals some of the issues that feminism has within itself. So this first wave feminism that campaigned for equal rights and those sort of things gave way then to second wave feminism, which wanted to say biology isn't destiny. The bodies that we have as women shouldn't define our roles in society, our roles in the home. It shouldn't matter. We should, and there's a sort of untangling then of the role of your sexed body in society. And it's not a big jump from that to these new approaches to gender, but that has brought a load of problems to the surface that now feminists are pushing back on.
So a sense in which it undervalues, like you say, women in society.
Well, what is a woman now? And if we can't define that, if that's got no stable category, then what becomes
then it all
of feminism?
becomes unstable, doesn't it?
In that sense, So those are some of the feminist pushback, but it's not just feminists who've been pushing back. So we saw how some of the new approaches to gender were about the ideas, and there has been pushback to those ideas. So I've called this logical, philosophical, scientific pushback, a querying of those ideas.
We're putting all of those in that category.
Yeah, that's the best way I could think of doing it.
Okay.
And so the first element of pushback is to say, if we're going to disconnect gender from our bodies, what does it mean to be male or female? There is no scientifically acceptable way of defining male or female without some kind of reference to our bodies. That's how the critique goes.
Yes.
So to understand what's being said here, we need to talk a little bit more about sexual dimorphism.
Go for it, Tim.
Okay, so if you're on board with that, here's a definition from the Encyclopaedia Britannica. So sexual dimorphism is the differences in appearance between males and females of the same species, such as colour, shape, size and structure, that are caused by the inheritance of one of or the other sexual pattern in the genetic material. So there's our posh definition. To translate that, in any species where you have differences that are around its reproductive ability, that's what we're talking about when we talk about male and female. We're talking about how it's organised around its ability to reproduce. That's what those words refer to, if that makes sense. And that is what has given male and female its meaning as a concept.
Yes.
So to say it better than I can say it, I want to refer to this quote from Doctors Lawrence Mayer and Paul McHugh, who wrote a long research article on sexuality and gender. So just to introduce them briefly, Paul McHugh is University Distinguished Service Professor of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And Lawrence was a research physician, epidemiologist and biostatistician for over 4 decades. He's now retired, so these guys knew what they were talking about. And they say that the underlying basis of maleness and femaleness is the distinction between the reproductive role of the sexes. In mammals such as humans, the female gestates offspring and the male impregnates the female. More universally, the male of the species fertilises the egg cells provided by the female of the species. And this conceptual basis for sex roles is binary and stable and allows us to distinguish males from females on the grounds of their reproductive systems, even when these individuals exhibit behaviours that are not typical of males and females. So that's the key thing. They say, this is how we distinguish maleness and femaleness.
It's a very clear pushback, like you say.
This is how we do it, not just in humans, but in all species. We look at reproductive systems in order to define those terms. And the question is, if we want to get rid of this, what is the alternative? And for human development, this sexual dimorphism happens very early in the womb. So first we have our chromosomes, and then those chromosomes determine the development of our different gonads, our sort of testes or our ovaries. And these in turn release sex-specific hormones which control the development of our genitals and our primary and secondary sex characteristics. And this is how it happens. And as Mayer and McHugh's pushback say, this is the stable basis for how we identify male and female. And it's probably helpful as well to say that we talked about DSDs earlier, where development isn't exactly like this. But even in DSDs, 99% of those with an intersex condition will still be unambiguously male or female. It's only a very small proportion of intersex people where the gender is ambiguous and parents and doctors have to make a choice about whether we raise this child as a girl or a boy. But even in most DSDs,
it leans sort of to male or to female.
You have this dimorphic sexual development either in male or female. And so the pushback is that for many then this is the only scientifically acceptable way of doing this. There's not an alternative. So this quote from Ryan Anderson, who has written a book confronting and critiquing the transgender movement. He said, I've searched dozens of references in biology, medicine, genetics, and can find no alternative scientific definition of sex. In fact, the only references to a more fluid definition of biological sex are in the social policy literature. There you go.
Wow.
So that's the first pushback, logically. The second one is related, and it is that if gender identity is something that's self-defined, detached from our bodies, then the terms male and female lose any stable meaning. So to illustrate this, Liz, I want to do a thought experiment with you.
Okay.
So you are cisgender, I believe, that your gender identity aligns with the sex you're assigned at birth, as am I. But if we were to be transgender, if you were to feel differently in your head, you would have to have a sense in your feelings of feeling like a man or feeling like a woman for me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, if that's going on, what is that feeling that is feeling like a man? Or for that matter, if you're cisgender, what is your feeling that is feeling like a woman? What is that inner feeling? Now, for that feeling to have content, it has to be connected to something outside your head.
Yes.
So to say I feel like I'm a man, if I'm just saying I feel like I feel, that's true, but it doesn't communicate any information. If I'm saying I feel like I'm a man, that man has to have reference to something going on outside my head.
Yeah.
And if that's not attached to bodies, it has no stable meaning.
Yes.
So this is the main philosophical pushback to these new approaches to gender, is to say, if our feeling, our very concept of male and femaleness is not tied to our bodies, it has no stable meaning.
Right.
And therefore, it doesn't make any sense to say, I feel like I'm a man trapped in a woman's body.
Because what does it mean to feel like a man?
If that feeling of a man isn't attached to bodies, then it makes no difference whether I'm in a woman's body or not.
Right.
It makes no difference. Why should I need to transition my body if the very concept and feeling of being a man or a woman isn't connected to our body?
Yes.
So this is the objection, really, that in the end we cannot detach these terms from our sexed bodies and them to retain any sort of stable meaning. I hope I've explained that clearly enough.
That does make sense. It definitely makes sense, because we've talked about it being a separate thing.
Yeah.
But like you say, the pushback is saying you can't actually separate them, because at some point we were going to refer to our biology.
Yeah, if those terms are going to retain any content, we can't totally get rid of them.
Yeah.
So it's a bit abstract, but it's a really important part of the pushback that's going on. Okay. The third area of pushback in this sphere is to say that there are actually observable differences between men and women in general. So this is pushback against the claim that gender differences don't matter, or you can't observe these things generally. Well, actually you can, is how the argument goes. And so for an example, I want us to look at the height of men and women. So this is a study that has been plotted on a graph, and you see the sort of up and the down. These are called bell curves. And so if you have a 6 foot tall person, you don't know in advance whether that's going to be a man or a woman.
No.
Because the graph shows us some women are 6 feet tall and some men are 6 feet tall. If you have a 5 foot person, you don't know if it's going to be a man or a woman, because the graph shows us that covers men and women. But if you do have a 6 foot tall person, 999 out of every 1,000 of them will be male. Only 1 in 1,000 6 foot people will be women. And that's what this graph shows us, that the average height of men and women is very different. And depending on what point we choose, it's more likely to be a woman and more likely to be a man. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to be short to be a woman.
Yes.
Of course you can be a 6 foot tall woman, and it doesn't mean you have to be tall to be a man. But in general,
we can make those generalisations, like you say.
And the generalisations are not stereotypes.
Yes.
They're true evidence by data.
Based on a level of fact.
Generalisations, that's right. Now, what I've done with height, researchers have done with many other characteristics as well, and physical differences between men and women, but also personality, preferences, the sort of choices that we make, skills, etc. And on many of these readings, they say there are generalised differences between men and women that we can observe, which doesn't mean we should reinforce gender stereotypes and say more men choose certain careers, therefore women can't do those careers. That's not the aim. The aim is to say we make different choices. And Abigail Schreier talks about this in quite a helpful way, actually. She said, although it's often considered insulting to note, women in the aggregate have different preferences. We tend to put people jobs over thing jobs. This has caused feminists a great deal of consternation. Pricked by the embarrassment of natural differences between men and women, they blame society and insist women need to be taught to adopt different preferences. But behind this insistence lies the idea that women's preferences are inferior. So we don't have to be the same, is what she's saying. We should accept and recognise our gender differences and give them equal value rather than trying to become the same. And so this is widely observed, and really interesting, some research has been emerging in recent years that the more equality between the sexes there is in a given society, the more women have freedom of opportunity and choice and ability to make their own choices, the greater those differences are manifest.
Yes.
So
I've heard that before.
Yeah, the more freedom that we have, the natural differences in Shry's words between men and women on aggregate will come
They seem to come out
fore.
more, those differences, or those,
Yeah, so this is part of the objection that actually there are observable differences in the aggregate, although that doesn't mean we need to reinforce stereotypes. And in fact, the objection goes further and says some parts of the new approaches to gender actually reinforce the stereotypes that we're ideally trying to deconstruct. So how would you know if a child is potentially got gender identity confusion, that they maybe feel they're the wrong gender? If you look at the handbooks that talk about this, part of the way they want you to identify this is to say, well, you know, do they play with typically girl toys or typically boy toys? Do they prefer?
But that assumes that there's a typically girl or boy toy, doesn't it?
Yeah, and more than that, it assumes that even if there is a typical, that if you're the exception, you might be the wrong gender.
Right.
But that then reinforces the stereotypes. So one of my daughters is into football, likes reading books that are typically boy books, prefers to wear shorts and trousers to dresses. Now, if that is evidence that she maybe has a different gender identity to a woman, just based on that, that would be to reinforce a stereotype that says these are boys' things, not girls' things, for example. And so this is some of the pushback. Again, we're not saying that every new approach to gender tries to do this, but this is one of the criticisms that is levelled. Again, not here to adjudicate it, but we need to know that that's being said.
Yep.
And finally, before we move on to a different area of pushback, the claim is also made that the promises of the new approaches to gender, the transgender movement, can often be misleading.
Right.
So one of the ones that has been talked about is the very idea that you can become a different biological sex to the one that you were born with. So we said earlier there's over 6,000 physical differences between men and women, not just primary sex characteristics, but all the secondary sex characteristics as well. And if you're trying to sell the idea, as the critics put it, that you can leave behind your maleness or femaleness and become the other, that is just simply misleading. The best hormone treatment and surgery in the world will never change all those differences. So again, there's a multiplicity of views and knowledge in that, but sometimes the presentation, particularly to children and young people, of you can just become the other.
It's not actually as simple.
Yeah, it's misleading at best,
as it's put across.
Harmful at worst, and leads to problems down the line, which we will come to shortly. And while we're talking about children, that we should go on really to say that that's another angle that the pushback's coming from, is a concern for children.
Yes.
We talked about the normalised treatment path, puberty blockers, social transitioning. And one big objection has been made that this actually locks in gender dysphoria into a child's life as they become an adult. So again, it'd be good to look at some statistics here. So these statistics are not controversial. They're agreed by, as far as I can tell, pretty much all sides in the debate, that if a child goes onto puberty blockers, socially transitions, adopts that intervention, almost all of those children go on to progress to hormone treatment and potentially surgery down the line, with all the consequences of that. The most significant being sterility, so eventually you lose the ability to have children. But without medical intervention, if no intervention of puberty blockers, drugs, social transitioning takes place, then researchers have found there's about a 70% desistance rate. So about 70% of children who experience some level of gender dysphoria, by the time they're adults, that will have resolved for them.
Okay, so by the time they've been through puberty, rather than stopping puberty happening, actually that can change.
Yeah, and the suggestion is that that desistance rate can vary a little bit depending on what's going on. But Kenneth Zucker is the scholar who's argued this in most detail. So if you look at that, it raises the natural objection then of, if we give children puberty blockers, we lock them into something that potentially, well, or probably, they would desist from.
Right.
And so in this, there's a whole heap of issues then about how do we know which kids desistance would occur and which would go on to have a transgender identity and potentially, you know, would want those further treatments. What research have we got? And the answer is not enough.
Right.
And so this is Hilary Cass, Dr. Hilary Cass. She led an independent review of the Tavistock Clinic and Gender Identity Services in the UK, published her report in 2024. And this is one of the main concerns that she had about the care we're offering children. So I just want to read you a couple of quotes from the summary of her report. The rationale for early puberty suppression remains unclear, with weak evidence regarding the impact on gender dysphoria, mental or psychosocial health. The effect on cognitive and psychosexual development remains unknown. So she says we just don't really know enough to be confident in this way of treating children. Clinicians are unable to determine with any certainty which children and young people will go on to have an enduring trans identity. And so she concludes, for the majority of young people, a medical pathway may not be the best way to manage their gender-related distress. For those young people for whom a medical pathway is clinically indicated, it's not enough to provide this without also addressing wider mental health and psychosocially challenging problems. So again, she's raising a flag and saying, we don't really know enough to be doing what we've been doing.
Right.
And again, I think that's admitted across both sides of the debate, that there's a shortage of high quality research in a lot of these areas. So, so this is where
debate going on there then.
And concern about what we're doing to these children on the basis of potentially insignificant evidence.
So that's where the concern comes from for how we're treating children medically.
Yeah, I think so. I think the Cass report captures a lot of that. And another thing the Cass report addresses, but is worth a separate point, is we have many people also saying the normalised treatment plan ignores the psychological bigger picture of what's going on for our children and young people. So for children presenting with gender dysphoria, there's higher than normal incidence of trauma, higher than normal incidence of autism, higher than normal incidence of other mental health conditions. And the normalised treatment plan has tended to put all of that to one side.
Is it ignoring?
That's the accusation.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the accusation, is that we're ignoring that psychological bigger picture. And that's why, as we just read in the Cass report, she sort of suggests there may be more appropriate ways to help these children than the way that we have been doing it. And these concerns were so significant that it actually led to the closure of the Tavistock Clinic. So we had a number of whistleblowers from within the organisation who came and said, I'm really concerned about the way that we're pushing children down this pathway, rather than being more aware of the bigger picture.
Looking at other issues or,
That's right, yeah. And so that led to the closure of the Tavistock Clinic. And there's still gender identity services provided by the NHS. It's important that we continue to do that in some form. But it's been a big enough concern to close the leading institution for doing this in our country. So again, these critical pushbacks aren't just from a small corner.
No.
Some of these are quite significant. In terms of other wider medical pushback, not just for children but for adults as well, it's important to say, having spent a lot of time explaining gender dysphoria earlier, how we understand the causes of gender dysphoria and the best treatment is contested.
Right.
So the new approaches to gender have led to an affirmative pathway that we explored earlier, but there's people putting their hands up and saying, I'm not sure that this is medically the appropriate way to do this. So the gentleman on the left here, my picture, Bob Withers, he's a psychoanalytic psychotherapist based in the UK, and he's spoken and written relatively publicly to say there's lots going on, often for people who suffer with gender dysphoria, and his sort of point really is that it's often psychological therapeutic interventions that are far more likely to be effective than necessarily going straight to hormone treatment and to surgery. Kenneth Zucker, that's our next picture, he has done research on desistance from transgender and the CAS report we've looked at. Some people say even more strongly. So Dr. Paul McHugh there on the right-hand side, as I say, he's distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins, and he said that in his research he concluded that pursuing hormone treatment and eventually sex change surgery, to quote him, was fundamentally cooperating with a mental illness rather than seeking to heal it.
It's quite stern
and
words.
hugely controversial.
Yeah.
Like, you say that in the public square now, that's a hugely controversial claim, because it continues to see gender dysphoria as a psychological disorder.
Yeah.
But that's his claim, is that to sort of medicalise that and treat it with hormones, etc., is to cooperate with that. And what these people want to point out is that this isn't the normal way we treat psychological conditions.
Right.
So if someone with anorexia was to walk into a psychologist consultant room and say, I feel like I'm fat, and therefore I want a course of dieting pills or something, the psychologist would not say, your perception of reality is going to be determinative for me, and therefore I'm going to treat you along the lines that you suggest. Their job is to have their own view of what's going on and to try and intervene for the best medical outcomes that are not necessarily determined by the person sitting in their office. But with gender dysphoria, that's not what we do.
That's not what's happening.
And so some of these psychologists are just flagging that and saying this is a very unusual way to treat a psychological condition. And then you've also got research done by these universities, so University of Birmingham, University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and University of Bern as well. They did some research on mental health outcomes for people who did pursue hormone treatment, surgery treatment, and their findings were that actually mental health outcomes didn't improve post-surgery over the long term, and therefore raised the question of, is this the best way to help people?
Is this actually doing what we say it's going to do? Yeah.
Is this offering them hope? Or in the long term, are their outcomes, mental health outcomes, pretty similar to if they hadn't gone through those sort of transitions? And the studies also say there's not enough research on this. We need to do better quality, longer term research. But that gives us a flavour of the medical pushback and what's going on in the conversation. So how we understand the causes and the treatment of gender dysphoria is contested. Also, medics are saying we can't use DSDs, these disorders of sexual development or differences of sexual development, we can't use these to deconstruct the normativity of a gender binary.
Okay.
We can't use the exceptions to deconstruct the norm.
Okay.
And this is a straightforward scientific argument, really, that what we do in science, in medical science, is establish what the norm is, and then things that are different, anomalies, are understood against that norm. That's how we make sense of them, define them, and often how we then treat them. If we flip that round and say, actually, intersex is the norm, and the sexual binary needs to be deconstructed, we're using the exception to control the norm, rather than the norm to understand the exception. And they just flag and say, that's incoherent, and we don't do that in any other area of medical science. So there's some strong pushback against that idea as well. And they also say that if intersex is normalised, if disorders of sexual development are no different, if you like, than those who might develop into male or female, then we also lose any reason to treat it or to seek to prevent it, because it's not worse, it's not abnormal, it's not a disorder, it's just a difference.
A different normal. Then
there's no case for medical intervention unless it's sort of causing distress. But then there's no case for prevention and these sort of... So you get into all sorts of medical ethical problems, actually.
Yeah, complex arguments.
If you normalise an anomaly, it's very difficult in terms of your medical ethics. Finally,
another pushback.
We've got one more, but it's actually a really important one because we've talked a lot about concepts. This helps to bring us back to people.
Right.
So part of the pushback now is coming from detransitioners. People...
Yeah, tell us what you mean by detransitioners.
So people that have transitioned, if they were male, have transitioned to female or vice versa, or some other gender identity, have had hormone treatment, have had surgery, and have then realised down the line that this hasn't been helpful or was the wrong decision, and they're now returning to their birth gender, if you like, to either the gender that was assigned at birth, if that's your preferred language, or their natal gender. And their claim is that the current culture, the current trans culture, is actually harmful and has been harmful to them.
To them personally.
And this is evidence that's anecdotal. Each detransitioner will have their own story. There will be other people who transition and don't feel regret. But it has become a substantial area of pushback. A lot of this is available on YouTube. That's where a lot of the cultural influence is, both for and against new approaches to gender. Yeah. So to close our look at this, I thought I'd just read one quote from a detransitioner who, somebody called Walt Heyer, who themselves detransitioned, created an online community for detransitioners and started collecting stories. And so this is one of the stories that he collected. So I transitioned to female beginning in my late teens and changed my name in my early 20s over 10 years ago. But it wasn't right for me. I feel only discontent now in the female role. I was told that my transgender feelings were permanent, immutable, and physically deep-seated in my brain and could never change. That's Deanna Atkins, we read that, it's innate, it's fixed.
Yes, it's fixed.
And the only way I would ever find peace was to become female. The problem is, I don't have those feelings anymore. When I began seeing a psychologist a few years ago to help overcome some childhood trauma issues, my depression and anxiety began to wane, and so did my transgender feelings. So 2 years ago, I began contemplating going back to my birth gender, and it feels right to do so. I have no doubts. I want to be male. I did have orchiectomy, the removal of testicles, and that happened before my male puberty had completed. So I have a bit of facial hair, which I never bothered to get electrolysis for, or laser for. And so the one blessing about all this is that with male hormone treatment, I can still resume my male puberty where it was interrupted, grow a full beard and deep voice like I would have had if transgender feelings hadn't intruded upon my childhood. My breasts are difficult to hide though, so I'll need surgery to get rid of them. And saddest of all, I can never have children, which I pray God will give me the strength to withstand that sadness. So these are anecdotes. Anecdotes are not data.
No, and like you say, we're talking about real people.
We're talking about real people. People who affirm the new approaches to gender, and people who have become detransitioners and are now actively working against it. And that's there in the debate, both sides of that. So hopefully that gives us a picture not just of the new approaches to gender, but the different places that this is being critiqued and pushed back on in our culture.
That's been really helpful, Tim, and I think we've covered such a lot of information there. We've looked at the new approaches to gender, and you've also taken us through a lot of the critical pushback. one thing we haven't talked about is Christianity in it all.
Yeah.
We haven't had the chance.
Haven't said the word God, I don't think, have we?
No, at all.
No.
So how are we going to explore some of that going forward?
That's the next video. So the next video will be, what does a Christian worldview have to say about gender? So we'll dive deeply into that there. And then in the third video, bring these first two together and say, well, what do we as Christians have to say to our culture then?
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. We hope you've really enjoyed our discussion tonight. To find out more about Unravelling and all of the things we have going on, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or check it out at amblecocc.org.uk/unravelling.